Hey everybody, Tag Life Done Free. Hey, I wanted to share something with you guys today. Many years ago, I ran across a cycle called the Tytler cycle, and it's had a big impact on me, and I hope it has a big impact on you. So, if you want to see how civilizations collapse, come on, check it out. So, somewhere around the year 2000, I became aware of this guy named Alexander Tytler. See, Tytler believed that every civilization went through a cycle, and this is now referred to as the Tytler cycle. He outlined 9 steps to the path of collapse for any civilization. Tytler said that a cycle starts out, with a society anyway, in the step of bondage. And then it goes from bondage to spiritual faith to courage to liberty to abundance, selfishness, complacency, apathy, and dependence. Once the cycle is complete, it starts over with bondage. It's just wash, rinse, and repeat. See, this theory fascinates me because it lines up with not only our history, but also where the country is right now. Most people are more interested in how they can get over on someone or how they can milk the country than they are interested in building something or contributing to a greater good. I believe we are clearly on the left side of this cycle. Apathy, maybe? Dependency, maybe? I would like to begin my conversation on the Tytler cycle with a quote from 1787, where Tytler portrays what we can expect from any civilization over the first 200 years. He said a democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that the voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship. The average age of the world's great civilizations from the beginning of history has been about 200 years. During those 200 years, these nations always progress through the following sequence. They go from bondage to spiritual faith, and from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, and from dependence back to bondage. It's very important to note that these words were 2 years before George Washington even became president. It's so amazing to me. A case could absolutely be made that we are in the final stages of this cycle. We need to take an objective look at the things that are going on today. We have voted in benefit after benefit. We have become dependent on the printing presses. We have leveraged our future again and again by the ever-increasing debt, now standing at over $30 trillion. By some estimates, our unfunded liabilities exceed over $200 trillion. Eventually, this recklessness will come due. Let's take a look at history. Let's see if we can find in each stage the acts that moved us into the next stage of the cycle. See, prior to 1760, the colonials lived in bondage from the French and then the English. Right about 1760, they began to transition to spiritual faith. Some of the events that went on there is King George III became the King of England. The Currency Act, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. So in 1764, Parliament passed the Currency Act, effectively assuming control of the colonial currency system. So this was from Great Britain, and they took control of the money system. The Sugar Act of 1764, also known as the American Revenue Act of 1764, was a revenue-raising act passed by the Parliament of Great Britain. And the preamble of the act stated, "It is expedient that the new provisions and regulations should be established for approving the revenue of the kingdom." Right? So they were taking from everybody else to fund their own war efforts and to fund their own conquests. This was followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, Okay, and this was an act, again, by the Parliament of Great Britain, which imposed a direct tax on the British colonies in America and required that many printed materials in the colonies be produced on stamped paper. From London, which included, the revenue stamp. Printed materials included legal documents, magazines, and playing cards, newspapers, and many other types of paper used throughout the colonies. And of course, it had to be paid in British currency. This was then followed by the Quartering Act of 1765. In the American colonial history, the British Parliament, the provision requiring colonial authorities to provide food, drink, quarters, fuel, and transportation to British forces stationed in their towns or villages. So basically, the colonials had to house them, had to feed them, right? Had to pay for them. Actually, and the resettlement over this practice is reflected in the Third Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which now forbids it. The Quartering Act was passed primarily in response to the greatly increased empire defense costs in America following the French and Indian War. Like the Stamp Act of the same year, it was also an assertion of British authority over the colonies. So they were kind of grasping by strings at that point. And so what they were saying is, hey, we're still the boss, we still own you. And at the same time, what they were trying to do is fund all these overseas wars, all these programs to do this and to do that. And does any of this ring a bell to you guys? Right? Have we funded these endless wars? Have we funded all of these programs, all over the place? And at the same time, where people here at home pay the price? The Townshend Act was passed by Parliament in 1767 and then also 1768, introduced a series of taxes and regulations to fund administration of the British colonies in America. Historians vary slightly as to which acts they include, but they were the New York Restraining Act, the Revenue Act, the Indemnity Act, the Commissioners of Customs Act. So basically, they were there to raise revenue in the colonies to pay salaries for governors and judges so they would remain loyal to Great Britain. So now they're bribing people, right? They also was to create more effective means of enforcing compliance with these different trade regulations. And in response to these things, right, as we transition, right, the Sons of Liberties were formed by John Adams and Paul Revere and John Hancock, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, some of them. But for those of you who don't know, the Sons of Liberty was kind of a loosely organized political organization active in the 13 colonies of America, and was founded to advance the right of the colonists to fight taxation by the British government. It played a major role in most colonies in battling things like the Stamp Act and also throughout the entire American Revolution. In popular thought, the Sons of Liberty was a formal underground organization with recognized members and leaders. More likely, the name was an underground term for any men resisting the crown, taxes, and the laws. The well-known label allowed organizers to make or create anonymous summons to like a Liberty Tree and a Liberty Pole or some other public place. Furthermore, a unifying name helped promote the colonial efforts against the Parliament and the Crown's actions. Their motto became, and I know everybody has heard this, no taxation without representation. So about 1770, we started to transition from the spiritual faith into great courage. And you know this because we had things like the Boston Massacre, right? Samuel Adams organized the committees of correspondence. We had the Boston Tea Party, right? The first Continental Congress and the Battle of Bunker Hill. Tom Paine also publishes Common Sense. I don't know if you guys read about this or not, but it was basically a 47-page pamphlet written in 1775 and 1776, advocating for independence from Great Britain. Paine collected various moral and political arguments to encourage common people in the colonies to fight for their own government. It was published anonymously in 1776 at the beginning of the American Revolution and became an immediate sensation. It was sold and distributed widely and read aloud at taverns and meeting places. In proportion to the population of the colonies at the time, which was about 2.5, 3 million people, it had the largest sale and circulation of any book published in American history. And as of 2006, it remains the all-time best-selling American title and is still in print to this very day. Common Sense made public a persuasive and impassionate case for independence, which had not yet been given serious intellectual consideration. But this time goes on. The Revolutionary War rages for over 6 years. British surrender at Yorktown, and then finally the Treaty of Paris ends the Revolutionary War. So obviously they had plenty of courage back then, right? So they gained this spirituality, which I think helped build that courage. And so now we're going to transition from courage into liberty. And liberty came in a lot of ways. And you guys, I don't necessarily agree with everything that went on here. Like some of this stuff I wish wouldn't have happened as we continue on this, but I think it does paint a good case to how we went from courage to liberty. This time frame is about 1784 to about 1865. So we went through the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitution was ratified by 13 states. As I mentioned, George Washington was elected, the Bill of Rights passed, the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the country. The Lewis and Clark expeditions began. You want to talk about liberty and freedom, right, at its finest. I mean, these were spreading out, all over the United States. I think another important thing that helped with this was Robert Fulton invents the steamboat. And why this is important is because then they could move goods up and down, the Mississippi River, and I guess other places as well, supplying, and then all of these little towns began to grow. The War of 1812, Britain was fighting with the French Empire, and the British Royal Navy blockaded France to stop it from trading with the other countries, to include America, and this angered the American people. In addition, the Royal Navy also captured a number of American vessels and seamen, and then they were put to work in the war efforts against France. Reacting to these actions, the U.S. then declared war on Britain in 1812, and this became known as the War of 1812. Some of the members of Congress in the United States actually hoped to add some of the Canadian territories to the United States of America through this war, but obviously that objective failed. In 1817, the era of good feelings began, and in 1817, James Monroe became the U.S. president. Monroe sought national unity by combining different political factions. The era also saw the end of the European wars, which allowed the United States to foster trade ties with the European nations. Americans enjoyed peace, prosperity, and a sense of national unity during this era. In 1823, I know many of you have heard this, the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, President James Monroe announced a new policy. According to this policy, European colonial powers were barred from colonializing any part of the American continent in the future. This policy aimed to put an end to the European ambitions in Central and Latin America. The policy was announced at a time when several nations in Latin America were fighting for independence from Spanish rule. This policy became known as the Monroe Doctrine, and it would become the basis for the American intervention in different parts of Central and Latin America against the European powers. In 1830, the Oregon Trail was established, right? And the American settlers started traveling to the Oregon Territory. This was a very long journey, and the route that was popularly used for making the journey famously became known as the Oregon Trail. The trail was first followed and established by settlers in 1830, and it ran for about 2,000 miles, starting in Missouri and ending in Oregon. The California Gold Rush started, right? The gold was discovered in California, and at the time, very few people lived in the area. The news of the discovery of gold obviously, spread quickly, and by 1848, nearly 100,000 people had arrived from different parts of the United States to California to try their luck. The California Gold Rush lasted for many years. In all, nearly $2 billion worth of gold was extracted from the rich gold deposits of California during the Gold Rush period. In 1854, the Gadsden Purchase is made. And so the U.S. signed a treaty with Mexico, and according to this treaty, the United States purchased an additional 30,000 square miles of area in the Southwest. This area comprises the modern-day southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. In exchange for the land, the United States government paid $10 million to the Mexican government. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln became president. By 1860, there was a very strong disagreement between the slave and the free states. The slave states in the South supported slavery and opposed Abraham Lincoln, and he was obviously opposed to slavery. The free states in the North supported Lincoln and opposed slavery. And in the 1860 presidential election, Lincoln was elected as the President of the United States. The slave states, I have to tell you, as you probably could imagine, didn't really like this outcome. So many of them started to leave the Union and to declare independence. In 1861, the Civil War began. The difference between the slave and the free states deepened, and by 1861, the free states were at one side and known as the Union, and the other side were known as the Confederacy. War began between the two sides on April 12th, 1861, and this war would be the bloodiest war in American history. In 1865, the Civil War ends. Most of the Confederate armies had been decisively defeated. General Robert E. Lee still commanded one of the last major Confederate armies. This army was completely surrounded by the Union Army under Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, 1865. Lee saw that he had no choice and surrendered his army. This effectively brought the Civil War to an end with the victory of the Union forces. In 1865, slavery is outlawed in the United States. Right? The U.S. Congress passed the 13th Amendment. This amendment made slavery illegal for all the territories of the U.S., as well as the territories where U.S. would have jurisdiction. The text of the amendment stated, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Other great things that happened: the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union was restored, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. As we transition from liberty to abundance, and this would be a period from about 1866 to 1969, there were some great things that happened during this period, right? We built the Panama Canal. We had the Roaring Twenties, right? In 1920, women were given the right to vote by a constitutional amendment. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge was elected president, and he appointed two new Supreme Court justices. Prohibition was enacted in 1919 and became law in 1920. The result was a rise in organized crime, including Al Capone's gang in Chicago. We entered World War II in 1939. Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and this event would push America to enter World War II. The Civil Rights Movement of 1954. Let me back up into World War II. When we talk about abundance, one of the I don't say great things that came out of World War II, but something that absolutely came out of it is it created this great industrial machine called the United States. Right? And so factories are pumping and all of these things, and this created all these jobs, and it created all this growth. Anyway, so back to the Civil Rights Movement in 1954. Between 1882 and 1968, African Americans had been denied the right to vote by southern states, in addition to being segregated from whites in schools, transportation, and other public places. In 1954, a series of events led to what would be known as the Civil Rights Movement. 1 year later, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her bus seat up and move to the back of the bus. Let me see, what else did we have? The first transcontinental railroad. Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone. We had the Industrial Revolution, as I was mentioning earlier. General Electric was founded. U.S. Steel was founded. The airplane was invented. The automobile was invented. Here's one of the ones that I don't like. The Federal Reserve was invented. The New Deal program from FDR was there. The Golden Gate Bridge was completed. The Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and Japan. I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, but the Marshall Plan was part of the Cold War strategy to turn former World War II enemies into allies by rebuilding their shattered economies. And if you think about this, it kind of worked, right? I mean, Japan, Germany, Italy, right? All three of those, you remember the Axis and the Allies, right? All three of those have become, allies. One of the enduring myths of early Cold War history involves the so-called Marshall Plan laid out by the Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947. With Western Europe in economic ruin, some American policymakers suggested that a massive injections of aid were necessary in order to jumpstart those economies. An anti-communist rationale was also offered for the program. And this is so fascinating to me because, it's like they create, and like they do today, right? They create the emergency and then offer a solution. The emergency was the spread of communism, and the solution was to dump, all of this money into Europe. Since communism was thought to thrive amid conditions of poverty and despair, economic recovery in Western Europe would undercut whatever attraction communist propaganda would have hold. In 1954, racial segregation in schools became unconstitutional. The Brown versus Brown was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court that declared state laws establishing separate public schools for blacks and white students unconstitutional. U.S., again, as I mentioned earlier, emerged from World War II as a great economic power. Right? Remember in the Cold War, let's talk about 1989. Remember when Ronald Reagan said to Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Well, the wall fell in 1989. Our interstate highway system was built. The Great Society programs were implemented. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but the Great Society was a set of domestic programs in the United States launched by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 64 and 65. The term was coined during the 64 commencement address, but it came to represent his domestic policy, and the main goal was the total elimination of poverty and racial injustice. Yeah, and how well did they do, right? I mean, this is so funny. Just like Ronald Reagan said back then, government, can't solve the problem because they are the problem. Another big thing, remember Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And then as we come from abundance and we start getting into complacency, I think some really important things happened, right? The creation, this is 1970 to 1989. We had the creation of the internet, right? Cell phones, Roe versus Wade. Remember President Nixon resigned because of disgrace. We had the oil embargoes of 1970. You've seen the rise to the gigantic military-industrial complex and the fall of the Soviet Union. From complacency to apathy, and just so I say, let's talk about apathy real quick. Really, it just means the lack of feeling or emotion or the lack of interest. As Americans begin to pull back, and maybe it's just because of the complete barrage of all of this information all the time. And again, one of the greatest things ever happened to humans was the creation of the internet. But at the same time, I think this created apathy in our society. But we had the Gulf War. And if you remember, Bill Clinton was elected, and, I did not have relations with that woman. And then obviously he was also acquitted. The stock market boom, right? It's going to be great forever. And I think this is also when you really begin to see the gridlock between the Democrats and the Republicans and, our political inadequacies. I think it began a long time ago, but I think you really start to see a lot of it right here. As we move from apathy to dependence, this is when George Bush was elected. This would be like 2001 through 2007. The NASDAQ stock bubble burst, the 9/11 attacks, right? The Patriot Act, came. Alan Greenspan lowered the rates to 1%. We invaded Afghanistan. Department of Homeland Security created, right? And that's so crazy how we created Homeland Security to protect Americans, right? We were dependent because of fear. Hurricane Katrina, right? Now we're dependent on FEMA. FEMA was needed. Look at how well they did. Home prices continue to skyrocket. What a lot of people don't understand about home prices is that it's manipulated. It's driven up for a reason. The more they drive the home prices up, the more they can tax you, right? And we got all these wars at this time going on, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. How do you suppose they pay for that? Well, what if we were to increase home prices? That way we could tax more, we could bring more in, right? The financial derivatives drive to over $100 trillion. And I think this is really about 2008 where I think the case can be made that we go from dependency and we go back into bondage, right? The housing prices collapse, bondage of bailouts, right? The financial firms collapse. You ever heard too big to fail? The government and the Federal Reserves intervened to prop up the worldwide financial systems at the cost of you, by the way. Government bailouts of financial firms, auto manufacturers. This is when I used to be a Chevy guy and I stopped buying them when this bailout happened. Now, I don't know if it was a good decision or a bad decision, but I stopped either way. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury committed over $8 trillion of taxpayer funds to fix this. And this is about the time when, Barack Obama was elected. Immediate borrowing and stimulus package exceeded $1 trillion. The Federal Reserve lowered the interest rates below 1%. And then fast forward to today, right? What are all the craziness going on? I mean, the COVID pandemic, stay home, we'll take care of you, right? More dependence. MAGA versus the left, the Great Divide, the Great Resignation. People leaving. I'm part of the Great Resignation, right? The people are leaving the workforce and they're taking their productivity elsewhere, which is called, going galt. I tend to believe that the above is pretty accurate, because we can see right now that the U.S. government under the Brandon administration is making an unprecedented power grab. I thought the last administration and the last one before that were bad. And they just continue to increase spending dramatically and increasing their socialistic hold over the American life. And, like he said very beginning of this video, he talked about how as soon as the taxpayers figure out they can vote themselves a raise, it just continues to decrease over time. And I think we're seeing this through Obama, through even Trump to some degree, and then certainly the Brandon administration. The current Republican Party leadership is the most radically socialist we've ever had. And I want you guys to hear what I said, the Republican Party, because I believe today it's really just one party, bickering over, who gets what. Clearly, we see the American public being apathetic and willing to allow the U.S. government to take over more and more of our lives, and thus becoming more and more dependent. And yet at the exact same time, we see outrage and the building frustration of a large segment of the population with protest events, petitions, and a plethora of, columns in conservative press decrying the power grab. But will it be enough? And, can we prevent it? As you examine the Tytler cycle, where do you think we are? Does it relate to what's going on today? And if it is relevant, how do you prepare for bondage? We as the American people have to release ourselves from the dependency of tyranny. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Are you okay with passing this torch to the next generation? At the end of the day,